We're going to finish chapter 12. Yep. Now, yesterday we talked about general equilibrium, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Great. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and how they lead an economy towards a general equilibrium in which every market clears. Now, we talked about constructing these aggregate demand curves and aggregate supply curves and find the general equilibrium by substituting pi's inflation rates and output values. Now, today we're going to finish talking about different shocks that can happen. We talked about shocks to demand, which will make demand curve change or respond, and in response to the changes in demand, supply curve will also respond. But now we're going to talk about shocks to supply. The difference between demand and supply shocks is that when there is a supply shock, demand doesn't change. Demand comes from the society. We are still like, if you're hungry, you're still hungry. It doesn't matter if you have food in the refrigerator or if you don't have food in the refrigerator. You will still be hungry. A nation is the same. But if you're no longer hungry, you will not cook yourself another meal. That's why when there is a demand shock, aggregate supply will react. Like in this example, see, there is an aggregate demand shock, a positive shock, which makes you suddenly you're more hungry. Like you just went to the gym, that's a positive shock, and you want more protein. In response to that positive shock, now your supply curve will react. In a single micro market, the reactions will be different, but this is about a macro, an aggregate market. So in response to the shock to demand, aggregate supply will react. But in response to shocks to supply, in this case, for example, only supply would change. Demand would be the same. So this is how I teach myself these aggregate supply shocks. So temporary negative supply shock curve moves, and you will move to a new short run equilibrium here. And of course, your long run supply curve doesn't change. A positive shock, something like this here, you can see that this is not a positive shock. Yep, this is a negative shock still. There's a positive shock example. A positive shock curve would shift to the right. Supply curve will shift to the right. Now, when it's a permanent shock, supply shock, your aggregate demand doesn't change. Again, demand stays the same when there is a shock to supply. What changes here is your aggregate supply in the short run and your aggregate supply in the long run. Therefore, this is a permanent negative supply shock. Let's look at this example. For example, in 1973, there was this Arab-Israeli war, and many countries issued an oil embargo on United States to discourage United States from selling arms to Israel. This caused like a disaster. Like everything went to absolute bad. Increases in food prices due to crop failures around the world as well made it worse, and also wage hikes immediately after determination of US wage and price controls. So these all like one disaster after, like not a disaster, one shock after another shock, we had this. In 1979, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted up and to the left because of these negative shocks to supply. Due to poor harvest and a doubling of oil prices as a result of, Iranian Revolution. So, seems like my parents managed to, let's move on. Negative supply shock in 1973 to 75 and 78 to 80. You can see that aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis, temporary negative supply shock. Your supply curve shifts to the left here. You move to a new equilibrium, and now you got your inflation rate, which is year to year. You can see how it changes. It goes up. And unemployment also goes up. This is a negative supply shock. So it causes an stagflation. The economy is stagnating, your aggregate output is falling, and at the same time, inflation is going up. So you got the worst of both worlds. A permanent negative supply shock is even worse because it will decrease potential output. So it's just decrease the capacity of the economy. It could be something like the Paris Agreement. If we don't grow our economy and if we don't change towards renewables, and renewables aren't developed enough to replace the fossil fuel industries, what will happen is that it will be a permanent negative supply shock, which would just decrease the potential of the economy by hurting like the natural capital of the economy. By, for example, not letting us drill for more oil in the ground. In that case, your long-run aggregate supply will shift left as well, which is like not really good, which is really, really bad. Here you can see. Demand, again, when there is a supply shock, whether it's permanent, temporary, positive, or negative, a supply shock doesn't change aggregate demand. A supply shock changes aggregate supply. Your supply curve shifts left. And when it's a permanent negative shock to supply, your aggregate supply curve also shifts left. So gradually, this will happen. A permanent negative supply shock shifted the long-run aggregate supply curve leftward, and the aggregate supply curve upward, which is the same. If you like, leftward is the same as upward. When your curve is upward sloping, a supply curve is always upward sloping. So a leftward movement is always like the same as an upward movement. In the late 1990s, two permanent positive supply shocks hit the US economy. In the 90s, first of all, healthcare industry managed to reduce medical care costs relative to other goods and services. This is I don't know like why it was like I was very interested once in US healthcare system to study it, but frankly it's too complicated. It's like if I want to be like a suspicious pessimistic person, I would say that it is intentionally complicated. It's like I tried studying it for a bit. I just couldn't understand many things. Like I can understand insurance risk and like all the expected profits that are associated with insurance policies. Like a car insurance is perfectly understandable. But when it comes to healthcare, it's just such a big, giant monster that I can't get around it. So I don't have a story to tell you about US healthcare. Just I surrender in front of the US healthcare system. But then the computer revolution. In 1990s, an industry was added to all the existing industries, and that was the tech industries, the internet, computers, everything that we had before, we still have. But now, in addition, we have a completely new industry, an industry that helps not only increase consumption, you want your personal computer, you want to listen to music, watch movies. I remember like 20 something years ago when I was very little, there was this computer games. It was like a tennis game on DOS and NC systems before Windows operating systems. That would be consumption, but also the ability to document files in like a digital capacity instead of writing things, the ability to communicate, to process data, to run statistical softwares and all of that, that revolutionized the whole managerial field. And in many other cases, specific softwares like AutoCAD or GIS, these softwares helped engineers tremendously. Like it changed the game completely. So raise productivity and potential growth rate of the economy. So the economy was actually gifted with this whole new market, with this whole new industry. So an entire new industry was added. These were permanent positive supply shock. And we saw the same thing happening in the past 10 years by high-tech companies and data, like these like companies like Facebook and Twitter and, well, Google was already there, but it's still like it's expanding its operations. So these social media companies and the whole new front line in acquiring data, processing data, sometimes not exactly without permission, but still, this is also considered a positive permanent shock because the economy, of course, only to the economy, it would be negative shock to everything else, but to the economy, it's a positive permanent supply shock. Why? Because now we have a completely new market. Now you have Facebook and Twitter on the stock market selling really good. They're really good. Like if you look at their growth rate of the stock price, you can see that it's going up like this. Very good. Now, this is also a positive permanent supply shock. Whenever there is a new invention, new market, something completely new that's been added to what we had before, that would be a permanent supply shock. Positive. These shocks led to a rightward shift in the long run aggregate supply, resulting in rising aggregate output, lowering unemployment, along with falling inflation. So this is like, it's the best. You can see your long run aggregate supply now moves to the right. Therefore, your economy can produce more while inflation remains the same. Excuse me, inflation is even lower. So at lower inflation rates, you can produce more. And this will be your new normal because of the aggregate demand. If aggregate demand reacts after years and years and years, then you will arrive at the previous inflation. But if the shock to the supply is the only thing that happens, you can see that your output will go up and your inflation will go down. And of course, your aggregate supply in the short run also shifts right. A permanent positive supply shock shifts both long-term and short-term aggregate supply curves rightward, which then leads to a permanent, this is important, this is a permanent rise in output. This is why economists are trying to, like at least classical and like old school economists, they try to discourage people, like business, not business, policymakers from playing with inflation and trying to spend time with these interest rate games and things like that, and get to the real stuff by improving trade, by improving investments in research and development. This can help people real, like, because it's the long term. The short run thing, you increase inflation, yes, you will enjoy the fruits for a little while, but then it's gonna come back and you'll have nothing. In the end, you'll have nothing, only more inflation. Now, conclusions. Aggregate demand and supply analysis. The shift in aggregate demand curve affects output only in the short run, aggregate demand, and has no effect in the long run. Furthermore, the initial change in inflation is lower than the long run change in inflation. Why? Because inflation expectation is backward looking. When your inflation goes up by a little bit, people will expect that next year it will go up by exactly a little bit. Now, that differences are added to what is causing that increase in inflation. When people don't expect inflation to go up at all, it will still go up because probably the government or a shock or something happened. Like, for example, right now, the government is keeping interest rates low, so to create inflation and lower unemployment, as mentioned in that New York Times article I posted on Moodle. But then next period, next year, people who didn't expect inflation will expect this inflation to happen. So the Federal Reserve needs to increase inflation even more. And it would cause more and more, it would be like a snowball from the mountaintop. Get bigger, 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 and it will be a giant pile of snow when it reaches the ground, when it reaches like the village at the foot of the mountain. So initial change in inflation is lower than the long run change, when the short run aggregate supply curve has fully adjusted. A temporary supply change, a supply shock, affects output and inflation only in the short run and has no effect in the long run and on aggregate demand. It's only affecting aggregate supply. This is very important. It would help you on your exams. Write it somewhere. A permanent supply shock affects output and inflation both in the short and the long run. The economy has a self-correcting mechanism that returns it to potential output and therefore natural rate of unemployment over time, but not natural inflation rate. You will go back to the potential output, but because of all those decisions by Federal Reserve and central banks, you're going to be left with high inflation unless you act. In this example, like in 1980, where was it? Okay, I can't find it. The head of the central bank moved to lower inflation rate. It was in this few slides. Yes, this one. Yeah, the Volcker disinflation. Unless you act. So self-correcting mechanism only brings you back to previous levels of output. Yep. Now, a permanent supply shock affects output and inflation both in the short run and the long run. It's a because it shifts the permanent aggregate supply curve. It affects everything in the long run. The economy has a self-correcting mechanism, which we talked about. Now, let's talk about different real-world examples. For example, in 2008, US economy suffered negative supply and demand shocks that led to rising inflation and falling output. The negative supply shock due to rising oil prices. Oil prices in 2008 was like $120 per barrel. It was unbelievably high. Just before the Great Recession, which like made things even worse. So shifted the short-run aggregate supply curve upward and to the left. The negative demand shock from a financial crisis shifted the aggregate demand curve to the left. So there was a shock to supply, aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. Negative demand shock from a financial crisis was added to that existing oil price shock, which caused aggregate demand to shift left. Therefore, after July 2008, falling oil prices, after Great Recession, oil markets crashed, which really hurt a few countries. For example, Venezuela. They didn't expect it. They started all those ambitious social welfare programs, and everybody was cheering them on. All these intellectuals and everywhere in the world, they were like, "You go, guys! You're perfect. Give free stuff to everybody." And then oil prices suddenly crashed. And the problem is when you give free stuff, you can't take it, because people would be very, very angry if you take their free stuff from them. So what happened is that they had to like keep raising inflation to artificially increase aggregate output so that they can maintain that much welfare program, and it caused and inflation went out of control because of this. Where is it? Yep, the initial changes in inflation is lower than the long run change. If you let it go out of control, it will take your control. It will just become bigger and bigger and bigger. And Venezuela suffered really bad, and is still suffering because of this. Okay, so yeah. Falling oil prices led to a short-run aggregate supply curve to shift right. It was horrible, it was very bad for Venezuela, but for the rest of the world, the oil buying countries, it was considered a positive supply shock, which caused the aggregate supply curve, a short run, shift to the right. But then aggregate demand continued to fall because of the Great Recession and loss of consumer confidence. By the end of 2009, unemployment continued to rise while inflation fell. So at least we no longer had a stagflation. We had like just a normal recession. So now the government has stepped in after that and caused inflation, all those bailouts, all money here, money there, to bring the economy back on a recovery. Here you can see a negative supply shock, shifted aggregate supply upward or leftward, and a negative demand shock, Great Recession, shifted aggregate demand leftward. So we went from here to here, less output, more inflation. But then, thankfully, at least for the United States and not Venezuela, worsening financial crisis, not yet, shifted aggregate demand further leftward, which kept getting worse and worse, leading a further decline to output and a fall in inflation. You can see here. But then oil prices fell and you arrived here. After the oil shock was removed, your supply, aggregate supply, went back to normal, but your aggregate demand kept falling and falling and falling. So you arrived at 0.3. Less output and less inflation. Now, aggregate demand and supply analysis can help us understand business cycle episodes in foreign countries such as United States, United Kingdom, and China during the Great Recession. Let's look at what happened in the United Kingdom, Great Britain. The United Kingdom suffered a negative supply shock in 2007 due to a rise, again, to the rise in oil price level, causing the short-run aggregate supply curve shift up or to the left, while in turn, it raised inflation. After 2008, oil prices fell. So supply side was rescued. So the short-run aggregate supply moved back to the right, shifted down, in other words. Meanwhile, a negative demand shock due to a financial crisis in the US caused the aggregate demand curve for the United Kingdom to shift to the left. So a negative demand shock caused aggregate demand curve shifting left, which is the whole Great Recession. When it started in the United States, because the United States is such a huge economy, it's basically the heart of the world economy, it caused a domino effect. So every country in the world was more or less affected by it, further lowering output and raising the unemployment rate while inflation fell. You can see here aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. A negative supply shock shifted aggregate supply leftward, increasing inflation and reducing output. This caused a negative demand shock. As well, it was caused by the Great Recession, which caused the aggregate demand curve leftward, while aggregate supply shifted down as oil prices fell. This led to a decrease in inflation and output. So this is the same thing that happened in the United States, happened in the United Kingdom. The financial crisis in the United States and subsequent economic downturn substantially reduced its demand for Chinese exports because the consumer in the United States lost its consumer confidence. Chinese corporations and companies, and also like multinationals, which is like mainly multinational corporations, which are producing in China to sell in the United States, lost their customers. So what happened, for example, companies like Foxconn, they suddenly lost all those contracts that they received from Apple, from Google, from Microsoft. And it's huge if you think about it, because, for example, in China, the #1 private sector employer is Foxconn. And Foxconn's main job is to just produce phones, computers, and these electronic equipment for Apple, Microsoft, and Google. And Foxconn is a huge corporation. They literally own cities in China. Like millions of people are living in like a dozen factories next to each other, and that's like a city. They really built a city. Like just Google Foxconn, you like, wow, they're really awesome. I really like that, like huge factories and everything. But then suddenly they lost all their customers. So bad things started to happen. A negative demand shock due to shrinking exports shifted China's aggregate demand curve to the left, resulting in a decline in both inflation and economic growth. After that, a massive fiscal stimulus package by the Chinese government and easy monetary policy, like lowering interest rate, trying to cause inflation by the People's Bank of China. People's Bank of China is the central bank of China. I really wish United States and China would just agree to rename their central banks just a central bank like everyone else. And the Federal Reserve and People's Bank, these are difficult. But yeah, it's the central bank of China. Like United States has the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, but they call it the Federal Reserve. China has a central bank and they call it the People's Bank of China. So yeah, this is it. It because of all the inflation they created, it shifted the aggregate demand curve to the right, resulting in rising output, growth, and of course, inflation. This is what happened. First, they suddenly lost all their customers. So let's see, a negative demand shock is shifted aggregate demand curve leftward, decreasing output and lowering inflation. Then the central bank has stepped in, caused inflation. The fiscal stimulus package increased aggregate demand, so it went back to where it was and restored long-run equilibrium values for inflation and output. So this is, you can see it's the same thing as happened in the United States. And right now we're seeing the same thing with COVID. Governments all over the world are causing inflation, trying to like fiscal stimulus packages and easing monetary policy to try to push their aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, basically everybody are for it, but some economists, like for example, Stiglitz, I read his article about how to get out this current situation, how to get out of this current situation. He says Stiglitz is it's considered like a left-wing economist, like he's like more like a higher taxes, more social welfare stuff economist. And I read his article. He said that this is very interesting. The person who advocated, like you would expect him to say, go ahead, do this. But he said this won't help alone. Because until COVID is taken care of, people will not demand as much as they did before. So first thing first, get rid of COVID, finish this pandemic, then you can get to work playing with your inflation. So this is what he said. He said that it made perfect sense to me, like that get rid of COVID first, do whatever you need to do to get rid of COVID, and then after COVID has been taken care of, then you have a normal economic recession. Before that, you don't have a like we never had a situation like this, because before people didn't spend money during an economic recession because they didn't have money. But now they're not spending money because they don't have money and they're afraid of getting sick. If I go to the bar, somebody coughs all over me, coughs all over my face, I may get sick. Many people are still afraid, especially older people are still afraid to spend money to go out and socialize. And economic activity goes down. In fact, I have a friend of mine who works for a company as an IT manager, and he said that the city is right now forcing companies by like reminding them, some city that you guys, I gave you all those stimulus packages. Now come on, open up, get your employees to come back to work. And they don't like to go back to work, but they have to, because companies are now under heavy pressure to open up and bring their employees back. Before, we never have that. Before, uh, when there was an economic recession, you only didn't have money. Now, got two different problems. You don't have money, and at the same time, you're afraid. You don't want to go out to the office and work in your office. You prefer to stay home. Like right now, I'm in my home behind my laptop, things like this. So that's the difference in nature between the two. Any questions? Been talking nonstop for an hour. Hope you're not sleeping. Any questions? All right. There is no questions. Let me just remind you that your final exam will be chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, plus 3 and 4. These two chapters are very important for you. So as a parting gift, I would like you to be forced to study them before we never see each other again. Hopefully, if you pass, which you will, I'm sure. Please don't even think about failing. That would be, you need to do something extremely magnificent and like admirable to be able to fail this course. So yeah, just chapter 3, all the stuff that we already covered, and you know what, like the important things: diminishing marginal return, constant returns to scale, the concept of rent. This R stands for rent. This is the return on your investment, the rent of your physical capital. This W stands for wage, what you get for your labor. What I'm getting right now when I'm teaching, I'm getting wages. What my landlord getting for owning this apartment is rent that I pay him. So this is very important concept of rent in economics. And real interest rate is basically the rent you pay for holding money in your hands. And when you think about it, if you like spend a few hours, just think about this, and then it clicks. Everything makes sense. Like the concept of rent with wages. Wages, what is wages? Wages is a rent. NC State is renting my time right now. Right now I'm teaching because I signed a contract that at this time, my time does not belong to me. It belongs to my employer, North Carolina State University. And in return, they're paying me. So wages, again, a form of rent. In economics, rent is the foundation of everything. You'll get a question about this on your final exam. And stuff that we covered before. So chapter 3, chapter 4. Yeah, this investment and saving decisions. This is needed for our stuff in chapters 9 to 12 through 12 to make sense. Now, we covered all of this, like autonomous investment and consumption, changes in taxes, and all of that. All right, so chapter 3 and chapter 9, 10, 11, 12, we already recently covered, so you should probably be fine. Is there any questions? Great. So if you're here, turn on your cameras. I will be waving with you because it's the last time we'll be seeing each other. And I'll have your final exam ready. Your midterms will be graded. Everything will be fine. Again, in this time, if there was any questions, you send me an email. I'll do my best to answer your email. And it was a great, it was a pleasure doing business with you. Really like this course. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
See you on the, like, I won't see you
Thank
again,
you.
but
Thank
good
you.
luck on your final exam. Take care.
Thank you so much.
I had a question.